Connection Private Limited is a cement manufacturing company that is looking to hire a process engineer with a minimum of 3-year experience to work in one of their largest plants in Chennai. In order for the unit supervisor to successfully complete responsibilities like effectively develop and optimize industrial processes and supervise operations, it is necessary that he or she must have the ability to work well with the other plant employees. The company has completed screening candidates based on functional role requirements and is now assessing behavioral competencies to assess if the candidate will be a good organization fit. In this interview, we will see Varun, the unit head, interviewing Aarti on her ability to communicate well with her team, understand goals of the team, and balance personal goals with that of the team. Let's see how the interview goes.
I understand that you are applying for a process engineer position. Would you like to tell me what makes you want to join our company?
Well, Connection is pretty well known in the market for being, doing great work and a very high-paced organization. And I would love to be a part of this journey and contribute to the organization.
It's nice to know that you have such a high opinion of our company. Where did you work before this?
I worked for a company called R&R Private Limited.
Okay, that's great. How large was your team at R&R?
About 10 people. We had production engineers, project managers, and we had a staff of about 80 plus workers.
Okay. So what was it like working for such a large team environment?
I think, Varun, it was perfect. When you work with a large team, you get a lot of ideas, there's a lot of collaboration. But somewhere, one thing that's very important for me as well, in my journey of work is that I also need to work on my own, while working with a team. So
yeah, that's understandable. But could pose a potential problem for you. We have an extremely collaborative work culture at Connection that requires us to actively work as a team at all times.
Don't you think Aarti may have been slightly intimidated at the beginning of the interview and therefore may not have divulged all the relevant information in one go? Instead of jumping to the conclusion that Aarti was not a collaborative worker, Varun should have asked her follow-up questions on how she handled this issue in her previous organization. Let's see how the interview would have looked if Varun had asked follow-up questions.
That's perfectly understandable. So how did you manage to find that balance when you were working with your previous team?
Well, what I did was we made a routine. So we would catch up in the morning as a team to, discuss the way forward, the processes, etc. And during the afternoon, we would take time off as individuals to think through the way forward and, ideas that we could come up with, and reconvene back in the evening as a team to discuss the ideas that we had kind of thought about and take the way ahead.
Looks like Varun is using the R of the probe framework to understand the responsibilities Aarti undertook to handle her issue.
Okay, that sounds great. But was your team okay with changing a routine they were used to and try something new? What were the different options? What were the different options you tried before you could convince them to do this?
Well, a change is never easy to accept. A change always gets resistance. So, and we had the same, people were used to a particular way of working. So what I had tried doing was, I tried convincing the senior members, 2 of them into this plan. And once they were, convinced on this way of action, they kind of convinced the team forward, and we realized that it started working for us.
By using the O of the probe framework, Varun seems to have understood the different options Aarti tried out to resolve her issue based on the reaction of her colleagues. Now, if Varun analyzes Aarti's answers a little more, he will also notice the B or the behavior displayed by Aarti and her ability to influence her team.
Interesting. So, how was the outcome?
Actually, great. A couple of months down the line, we realized that initially what used to take us 2 days, for a particular work to kind of move ahead with this new change of plan, we actually managed to do it within a day. So worked really great for us.
Varun seems to be closing the circle by asking about the E of the probe model to understand the eventual outcome of Aarti's efforts. Let's get back to the current interview and see what other questions Varun has for Aarti.
Can you tell me about a time when you worked on a team project and failed?
Okay. The one example that comes to my mind is we were given a task of, kind of coming up with a lean production model where we actually had to minimize wastage and bring about profitability by about 15%. And that was a project that somewhere did not work out the way it was supposed to work out for us. So in fact, if I remember correctly, when we were closer to the end of the project, we hardly had met our targets. That's one failure project I can remember very clearly.
Okay, so what was the prevailing situation at that time that led you to being unable to meet your goal?
Honestly, when I look back, we realized that the project was challenging in itself, and we somewhere did not start the way it should have started. The deliverables were not defined very clearly among the individuals who were managing the project, and because of lack of communication and deliverables not being very clear, we somewhere could not really achieve the targets we were supposed to achieve.
Okay, sure, I understand. So Aarti, can you tell me about a time when you had to handle a challenging situation with your team?
The failure question was a good question to understand the P or the prevailing situation from the probe model. But if Varun's intent was to gauge Aarti's self-awareness and her ability to learn from her mistakes, how can Varun make an assessment without asking her follow-up questions on a situation? As of now, it would seem that Varun's only takeaway is that Aarti has failed in completing projects in the past without knowing if this was a one-off incident or a pattern. Let's see what else Varun could have learned if he had asked a couple more follow-up questions.
So was this the first time when you didn't define and track responsibilities?
This wasn't the first time, but this was a very critical project. And looking back, we realized that, because we did not really define the responsibilities well and the communication channel wasn't really clear, we ended up losing a lot of money in the project. So one learning was that, we learned to define the roles and responsibilities very clearly for future, tasks to ensure that we never got into a similar situation like this.
Varun details the P or the prevailing situation a little more to understand the context and background in which they were operating. This should give him a better perspective on the real reason for such a failure.
So Aarti, could you be a little more specific about your role or responsibility in identifying this miscommunication?
Looking back, we realized that there was a lot of blame that happened among the team members because nobody took ownership and, the roles and responsibilities were not clear. What I realized looking back was that, that our email conversations also did not track all the points that were discussed. In fact, there were certain open points like, as discussed, in the email chains, which obviously hinted that there were conversations that were taken offline and not documented properly.
Candidates typically have a tendency to use the word we. It is important to identify the role played specifically by the candidate in the situation described so as to measure his or her ability. This question should help Varun understand the R or the responsibilities that Aarti had of having to identify the miscommunication.
So what were the options available to you to rectify this situation?
Learning about the different options Aarti had to choose from will help Varun understand Aarti's thought process before she carried out a specific action.
Looking back, we realized that there could have been multiple options that we could have tried. One, of course, would have been holding regular team meetings on the project deliverables where each member would give a status update. Another option, of course, would have been having clearer mail conversations with all points captured, that were discussed or segregated among members. I took a lead here, and I realized that one of the safest way to ensure, we do not get into a similar situation in future would be having a shared document where the roles and responsibilities and all discussion points would be tracked against members. And as we move ahead, we would be kind of tracking all points on the tracker.
Aarti's answer should have provided Varun insight into the B or the behaviors displayed by her of having an eye for detail, knack for organization, and the ability to visualize the requirements to work with a team.
Okay. And what was the eventual outcome of this incident? What were your key takeaways?
I think the most important takeaway was the importance of communication, which we lacked in our earlier failure spot. And with a shared document, people became clearer on their responsibilities and expectations, and work happened the way it was supposed to happen.
Considering how Varun asked a question about a failed project to understand if there was a tendency to miscommunicate, the original outcome seems to be quite clear. However, by asking about the takeaway, looks like Varun is trying to understand the E or the eventual outcome of the responsibilities undertaken by Aarti to address this issue. Let's go back to the original interview and pick it up from where Varun had asked Aarti a question about a challenging situation.
Okay. So Aarti, can you tell me about a time when you had to handle a challenging situation with your team?
Many, actually, given the kind of work that I've done, in my current organization. But if I have to quote one, I'll give you an incident where, we were actually working on a delivery for a very, very important client. And the challenge here was there were actually two important challenges that we had to face. One was that the delivery time was in a very strict, timeline. We had very short time to deliver, and we were working in a team where the workers and the managers were not on good terms. They did not see eye to eye. So, there was a lot of conflict. Plus, the time that we had was very less. So it was a very, very difficult situation that, we had to face for that particular work.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Aarti, these were all the questions I had for you today. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I'm good, Varun.
Once again, Varun only employs the P element of the probe model and does not ask follow-up questions on the remaining elements. Without learning about the actions taken and behaviors displayed by Aarti and the eventual outcome of the incident, do you think Varun will be in a position to make a fair assessment? Let's look at an alternate scenario where Varun does ask a couple of additional follow-up questions.
I can understand. And was it your responsibility to handle the situation?
Well, not really. It wasn't really my responsibility to handle the situation completely. But at that point of time, I was probably best suited to handle it.
Looks like Aarti isn't the kind of employee that would shy away from work even if it wasn't hers. Varun seems to have learned this aspect about Aarti while asking about the R or the responsibilities taken by her while handling the situation.
And how did you handle the situation? What were the options available to you?
Well, we actually had a couple of options. So one option, of course, was that, we get in more temp resources to work because the delivery was over, a long weekend, a festival weekend, and people, were not keen to do overtime. So one option, of course, was to get temp resources. However, we realized that, getting temporary resources and training them and making them do the work would only hit our timelines. So the other alternative and probably the only option available to us was to convince the current workers to deliver within the timelines that we had.
This question should help Varun gain insight into Aarti's thought process and learn about the different options she weighed before carrying out the most favorable action. Varun seems to have employed the O or the options of the probe model. If we were to analyze Aarti's answers, we should also be able to see the B, or the behavior displayed by Aarti, of being able to logically reason and communicate and influence people.
Okay. Sounds like a good route to take. So what was the outcome, final outcome? Were you able to complete the delivery on time?
This question helps Varun understand the E, or the eventual outcome of Aarti's actions.
Yes, we could. We managed to convince the workers, to see the importance of the delivery, and also, make them realize that, when we could, if we could complete this delivery, their salaries and bonuses would also have a positive impact. Realizing the importance, of the entire project, the workers agreed, to do the overtime, and we managed to close the project.
Sounds good. Well, Aarti, these were all the questions I had for you today. Do you have any questions you would like to ask me?
No, Varun, I think it's been a good conversation, and I'll wait to hear from you. So nothing at this point of time.
In this video, if you notice, Varun began by asking good questions to understand the prevailing situation. However, by not completing the probe framework and not asking the right follow-up questions, do you think he was getting enough information to assess Aarti fairly? Looks like he was largely relying on first impressions. Based on first impressions and the limited information he would have received by only following the situational questions, he may have actually rejected Aarti's application. If Varun applied the additional follow-up questions as shared in the video, he could have gathered the necessary information and learned that Aarti has demonstrated the behavior required to work well in a team. For a good interview to happen, it is important for the interviewer to follow the probe framework and use the right follow-up questions to understand the candidate's past performance in detail.